The Senate just did something that hasn't happened in a very long time. It voted against presidential war powers, and this isn't just another political skirmish in Washington. What we're witnessing is a fundamental crack in the executive branch's monopoly over military intervention, a power that's been expanding unchecked since World War II. For decades, presidents from both parties have bypassed Congress when it comes to deploying troops, launching strikes, and engaging in conflicts that cost American lives and trillions of dollars. The constitutional framework our founders established, where Congress alone holds the power to declare war, has been eroded so completely that we have almost forgotten it existed. But this Senate vote represents something deeper than partisan opposition to Trump. It's a recognition that the imperial presidency, this unchecked executive authority over life and death military decisions, has become unsustainable. The economic consequences alone are staggering. Endless military spending drains resources from healthcare, education, and infrastructure, while enriching defense contractors and perpetuating a war economy that benefits the few at the expense of the many. What Trump is experiencing now is the same structural resistance that any president faces when the institutional momentum of militarism meets genuine constitutional oversight. This moment forces us to ask fundamental questions about who actually controls American foreign policy and whether democratic accountability still means anything when it comes to war. Let me begin by situating this moment historically, because what we're seeing isn't an aberration. It's the logical outcome of contradictions that have been building in American political economy for generations. The Senate's vote against Trump's war powers represents a rare instance where the facade of democratic process actually interrupted the machinery of empire. And to understand why this matters, we need to look at how we got here. Since 1945, the United States has engaged in military operations in Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Iraq twice, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and countless smaller interventions that most Americans couldn't even name. In how many of these did Congress formally declare war as the Constitution requires? Exactly one. None of them. The last formal declaration of war was in 1942. What replaced constitutional process was a series of authorizations, resolutions, and executive decisions that gradually transferred war-making power from the legislative branch to the executive, creating what historians call the imperial presidency. Now, you might ask yourself, why did Congress allow this to happen? The answer lies in understanding the economic and political incentives at work. After World War II, the United States emerged as the dominant global power, and American capitalism required global reach to access markets, resources, and cheap labor. The military became the instrument for maintaining this reach, and a permanent war economy developed around it. Defense contractors, oil companies, financial institutions, and a whole network of corporations benefited enormously from American military presence around the world. Members of Congress, dependent on campaign contributions from these same interests, had little incentive to challenge presidential war powers. In fact, voting for military action became politically safe. You could appear strong on national security, while voting against presidential military authority risked being labeled weak or unpatriotic. The structural incentives all pointed in one direction: give the president whatever military authority he wants. This brings us to Trump and this particular moment. Trump came into office with rhetoric that was simultaneously isolationist and belligerent. He criticized endless wars and promised to bring troops home, yet he also surrounded himself with hardliners who pushed for aggressive confrontation with Iran, maximum pressure on China, and expanded military operations in Africa and the Middle East. This contradiction isn't unique to Trump. It reflects a deeper tension in American capitalism between nationalist impulses and imperial necessities. The American economy is globally integrated, dependent on dollar hegemony, access to foreign markets, and control over strategic resources, particularly energy. Any president, regardless of campaign rhetoric, faces enormous pressure from the national security establishment, corporate interests, and the foreign policy blob to maintain American military dominance. What changed with this Senate vote? Several factors converged. First, there's growing public exhaustion with endless wars. The Afghanistan withdrawal, however chaotic, reflected a genuine popular sentiment that 20 years of occupation had achieved nothing worth the cost in lives and resources. Second, the economic contradictions of militarism have become more visible. Americans can see infrastructure crumbling, healthcare costs crushing families, student debt creating generational poverty, and they're starting to ask why we can spend trillions on military operations abroad while claiming we can't afford basic social programs at home. Third, and this is crucial, the geopolitical landscape has shifted. China's economic rise and Russia's resistance to Western hegemony mean that American military dominance is increasingly contested. The Senate vote reflects an awareness that unlimited presidential war powers in this new multipolar environment could lead to catastrophic great power conflict. But let's dig deeper into what Trump's reaction reveals about executive power and class interests. When Trump loses it over the Senate vote, he's not just expressing personal frustration, he's defending an institutional prerogative that serves the capitalist class. The ability to deploy military force without congressional approval gives capital enormous flexibility. It means that when American corporate interests are threatened anywhere in the world, the president can respond militarily without the messy, time-consuming process of democratic debate. When oil supplies are at risk, when a government threatens to nationalize resources owned by American companies, when a region threatens to break from dollar dominance, the president can act immediately. This isn't about defending American democracy or spreading freedom. Those are ideological cover stories. It's about defending the global position of American capital. Consider the economic dimensions more carefully. The United States maintains roughly 800 military bases in more than 70 countries. This costs American taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Who benefits? Defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon and Northrop Grumman receive massive government contracts. Oil companies get protected access to Middle Eastern resources. Financial institutions maintain the dollar's role as global reserve currency, which allows the US to run enormous trade deficits while exporting inflation to the rest of the world. Tech companies get government-funded research and development through military spending, then privatize the profits. The military-industrial complex isn't just a phrase, it's a material reality where public resources are transferred to private profit through the mechanism of permanent militarism. Now, when the Senate votes to restrict presidential war powers, it's not because senators suddenly became pacifists or socialists. It's because the contradictions of American empire have become so severe that even mainstream politicians recognize the system is unsustainable. The national debt has exploded past $34 trillion, much of it driven by military spending. China holds over $1 trillion of that debt and is increasingly unwilling to finance American militarism. The petrodollar system that has underwritten American hegemony since the 1970s is fraying as countries increasingly trade oil in other currencies or through bilateral arrangements that bypass the dollar. Saudi Arabia is negotiating with China in yuan. Russia is settling energy trades in rubles and rupees. Iran trades oil with China outside dollar systems entirely. These aren't just economic adjustments, they're direct challenges to the financial foundation of American global power. Trump's response to the Senate vote must be understood in this context. He's defending not just his own authority, but the entire architecture of American imperial management. When he claims the Senate is undermining American strength or national security, he's articulating the logic of empire, that American global dominance requires concentrated executive power to respond to threats instantly, without democratic oversight slowing things down. This logic has been accepted by both parties for decades. Obama expanded drone warfare without congressional approval. Bush invaded Iraq on false pretenses with a minimal congressional resistance. Clinton bombed Yugoslavia without a declaration of war. The pattern is consistent across administrations because it reflects structural imperatives, not individual personality. But here's what makes this moment potentially significant. The Senate vote suggests that even within the ruling class, there's recognition that the costs of imperial overreach are becoming unbearable. Military spending crowds out domestic investment. Endless wars create blowback and instability. Aggressive confrontation with China and Russia risks nuclear escalation. The global south is increasingly resistant to Western domination, forming alternative institutions like BRICS that challenge American economic hegemony. In this context, unlimited presidential war powers look less like a tool of strength and more like a liability that could drag the country into catastrophic conflict. Yet we must be careful not to overstate what this Senate vote represents. It's not a fundamental challenge to militarism or imperialism. It's a tactical adjustment by one faction of the ruling class that believes American global dominance can be better maintained through different means, perhaps through economic coercion, through multilateral institutions, through technological supremacy rather than direct military intervention. The Senate isn't questioning whether America should dominate the global economy. It's questioning whether unlimited presidential war powers are the most effective tool for maintaining that dominance given current conditions. This is where a class analysis becomes essential. The debate over war powers isn't primarily about democracy versus authoritarianism, though it's often framed that way. It's about how to manage an empire in decline, how to maintain capitalist class interests when American economic supremacy is being challenged, how to extract wealth from the global economy when military dominance alone is no longer sufficient to guarantee compliance. Different factions of capital have different strategies. Some believe continued military aggression is necessary to defend American interests. Others believe that approach is bankrupting the country and undermining long-term competitiveness. The Senate vote reflects this intra-elite conflict. For working people, both in the United States and globally, the question isn't which faction of the ruling class has the better strategy for managing empire. The question is whether we can build sufficient political power to challenge militarism and imperialism altogether, to redirect resources from weapons and warfare toward human needs, to create an international system based on cooperation rather than domination. This requires understanding that American militarism isn't an aberration or a policy mistake. It's a structural feature of how American capitalism operates globally. It's how corporations access cheap labor and resources abroad. It's how financial institutions maintain dollar hegemony. It's how the ruling class disciplines any government that threatens American economic interests. The Senate vote against Trump's war powers is a small crack in this structure, but only mass popular mobilization can widen that crack into genuine transformation. We need to connect opposition to endless wars with demands for healthcare, education, housing, and climate action. We need to show that the trillions spent on militarism represent resources stolen from social programs. We need to build solidarity with working people globally who suffer from American military intervention. This isn't about nationalism or anti-Americanism. It's about recognizing that the same ruling class that exploits workers domestically also exploits the global South through imperialism, and that our liberation is connected. Trump's outrage at the Senate vote reveals his commitment to executive power and his alignment with the most aggressive factions of American capital. But we shouldn't romanticize the Senate's position either. Both represent different management strategies for an exploitative system. Our task is to build a movement powerful enough to challenge that system at its foundations, to create democratic control over economic and foreign policy, to end the subordination of human needs to profit maximization. The contradictions are deepening, the costs of empire are mounting, and moments like this, Senate votes show that even the ruling class recognizes the current path is unsustainable. The question is whether working people can organize effectively enough to push through fundamental change rather than just accepting adjustments to how empire is managed. That's the real significance of this moment. And that's what we need to focus on building.